On a bitter winter night, a man of immense wealth did the unthinkable. Behind the polished walls of his mansion, hidden from the eyes of society, he dragged his two frail twin daughters toward a metal freezer in the basement. The little girls trembled, not from the cold yet, but from the terror in their father's eyes. And outside, under the pale moonlight, a white horse shifted uneasily in his stable. His instincts told him something was terribly wrong. What followed would shake the entire town, for this was not just a tale of cruelty, but of loyalty, courage, and the justice that came from the most unlikely hero, a horse. The day began like any other in the small frontier town. Frost still clung to the wooden fences, and smoke curled gently from the chimneys. Inside the grand estate at the edge of town, the wealthy businessman Edward Harlow presented himself as a man of success. To his neighbors, he was charming, generous at church, always with a polished hat and a smile too perfect to question. But behind those tall iron gates, his world was far from gentle. In a dim room on the second floor, two little girls, identical twins no older than 7, sat huddled together on a rug. Their names were Clara and Elsie. They were fragile, with wide hazel eyes that carried both innocence and fear. They had learned long ago that their father's smile in public meant nothing inside the house. Their only comfort was each other, and the horse. Out in the paddock stood Snowfire, a magnificent white stallion with a flowing mane. The girls adored him, sneaking bread crusts and apples from the kitchen whenever they could. They whispered their secrets to him through the wooden fence, and somehow, he seemed to understand. When the twins pressed their small hands against his warm muzzle, the world felt less cruel. That morning, Clara and Elsie had crept to the stable while the frost still sparkled. "Snowfire, someday we'll leave this place," Elsie whispered, hugging his neck. Clara giggled softly, adding, "And you'll come with us. We'll run far, far away." Snowfire snorted gently, stamping his hoof as if promising he would. From a distance, the house looked like a picture of wealth and order. But cracks ran deep beneath the surface, and soon, the peaceful illusion would shatter. The evening began with silence. A silence so heavy that even the ticking of the grandfather clock in the grand hallway seemed to cut like a blade. Edward Harlow sat in his study, a glass of brandy trembling slightly in his hand. His face, once the portrait of a confident tycoon, now looked hollowed, drawn tight by months of hidden debt and the slow collapse of his empire. Stacks of unpaid bills and letters from creditors cluttered his desk. He had gambled on railroads, mines, and new industries, yet every venture seemed cursed. Behind the polished veneer of his estate, he was a man cornered, choking on pride. In his twisted reasoning, there was only one thing left to cut away: his daughters. Clara and Elsie. 7 years old. Fragile, sickly, always in need of medicine. To Edward, they were not children, at least not in this dark hour of despair. They were burdens. They were reminders of his failures. Their mother had left years ago, unable to bear his cruelty. And now, he convinced himself that the twins were the cause of everything that had gone wrong. As the night deepened, Edward's steps echoed sharply across the mansion floor. He ascended to the second story, the smell of brandy lingering on his breath. Inside their room, Clara and Elsie sat huddled beneath a thin blanket, whispering lullabies to each other the way their mother used to. The crack of the door swinging open made them jump. Edward stood there, looming, eyes bloodshot, jaw clenched. "Get up," he growled. The twins froze. Clara, the braver of the two, whispered, "Papa, it's late." "Quiet." His voice thundered. He grabbed them both by their thin wrists, dragging them from the bed. Their small feet scrambled against the polished wood floor, their cries swallowed by the vast emptiness of the house. Down the staircase he hauled them, his grip merciless. Elsie sobbed, "We'll be good, Papa. Please, don't be angry." Clara tried to shield her sister, whispering, it's okay," though her own voice quivered with terror. They reached the basement door. Edward kicked it open, the hinges groaning. The air grew colder as they descended, lantern light flickering against stone walls. And then they saw it. The old industrial freezer. It stood in the corner like a silent coffin, steel, heavy, reeking faintly of rust and ice. The girls stopped dead, trembling. Their instincts screamed what their young minds could barely comprehend. Edward yanked the lid open. A blast of icy air rolled out, stinging their cheeks. Inside, he ordered flatly. The girl's eyes widened in horror. Clara shook her head violently. "No, Papa, please. We'll be quiet, we promise." Elsie sobbed uncontrollably, clinging to her sister. "Don't put us in there. We're scared." But Edward's heart had hardened. Pride, shame, and madness had fused into cruelty. "You've brought me nothing but ruin," he spat. "Better you freeze than drag me further down." With brutal force, he shoved them toward the freezer. Clara tried to resist, digging her heels into the floorboards, but his strength overpowered her. Elsie shrieked, her voice echoing off the stone walls, but he lifted them both and hurled them inside. The lid slammed shut. Darkness. Cold. The sound of muffled fists pounding against steel. The twins screamed, their voices muffled into sobs. Tiny fists banged frantically, weakening as the chill bit into their skin. Tears froze on their lashes. Clara clutched Elsie tightly, whispering, "Stay awake, don't sleep," her lips quivering. Elsie whimpered, "I'm so cold." Above them, Edward stood panting, his chest rising and falling like a man possessed. For a moment, silence filled the basement. Then he turned, locked the freezer latch, and walked away. His footsteps faded until only the faint sound of the twins' cries remained. Outside, the night was alive with wind. Snow pressed against the stable doors, rattling the wood. Snowfire, the great white horse, lifted his head suddenly. His ears pricked forward, his muscles stiffened. He heard something. He felt something. Not the storm. Not the usual groans of the house. This was different. It was panic. It was the sound of fear carried on vibrations no human could hear but a loyal animal could sense. Snowfire whinnied sharply, pawing the ground. His breath steamed in the frosty air, each exhale louder than the last. He stomped, restless, turning his head toward the mansion. His instincts screamed at him, the little ones were in danger. The twins' sobs grew weaker. The freezer walls closed in. Their tiny fingers slipped against the frozen steel. And in their fading breaths, they whispered the only name that gave them hope. Snowfire. At that exact moment, the stallion reared in his stable, slamming his hooves against the wooden gate. The latch rattled, ready to give. The night was no longer still. It was the beginning of a fight for life. Snowfire's muscles quivered under his sleek white coat. The stable was dark, but his eyes gleamed like molten silver in the moonlight seeping through the cracks. He could feel it, something was terribly wrong inside the mansion. He had always been attuned to Clara and Elsie's presence, their laughter, their soft hands against his muzzle. Tonight, the silence that replaced their voices was unbearable. The cries he had caught faintly through the storm had not been imagination. They were real. They were desperate. Snowfire pawed at the dirt floor, snorting, his breath steaming like smoke from a fire. He pressed against the stall door. Once. Twice. The wood creaked but held. He reared, slamming down with his hooves until the iron latch rattled violently. With a final surge of muscle, he threw his weight against the door. The latch snapped. The door burst open. Snowfire lunged into the yard, mane flying like a banner of defiance. The icy wind cut at his skin, but he hardly felt it. His ears flicked toward the mansion, where a dim lantern glow bled from the basement windows. From within the stone foundation came a faint, irregular pounding, tiny fists against metal. He galloped around the house, stopping at the narrow basement window half buried in snow. He lowered his head, snorting hot breath against the glass, fogging it white. Inside, faint shapes moved, the twins, their little hands pressed weakly against the frosted pane. Snowfire's heart thundered. He pawed at the ground, scraping deep into the snow and dirt near the window. But the walls were stone, immovable. He pressed his muzzle harder against the glass, as if to tell the girls he was there. Clara's tiny palm slid against the frost from the inside, trembling, before slipping down. He whinnied, loud and sharp, rearing in frustration. The sound cut through the storm like a blade. Then he made a decision. If he could not break them free himself, he would bring others. With a burst of speed, Snowfire turned from the mansion and thundered down the road into town. His hooves struck sparks against the frozen cobblestones, echoing in the night like warning drums. In town. The sheriff's office sat quiet at the edge of Main Street. Inside, Sheriff Wallace had dozed off in his chair, hat tipped low, while two deputies played a slow game of cards. The night was still, until the sudden clamor of hooves shattered the silence. Snowfire barreled into the street, nostrils flared, eyes wild. He stopped in front of the office, stomping and whinnying fiercely, rearing up as if demanding to be seen. Deputy Collins jumped to his feet. "What in?" "That's Harlow's horse." The sheriff stirred, blinking. "Loose at this hour?" He stepped outside, lantern in hand. Snowfire pawed the ground furiously, then darted a few steps toward the edge of town, stopping to look back. His entire body screamed urgency. Sheriff Wallace frowned. "That's no ordinary spook. He's trying to tell us something." Deputy Miller scoffed nervously. "It's just a horse." But before he could finish, Snowfire reared high, his hooves slicing the air, neighing with a desperation that chilled their bones. The sheriff's jaw set. He trusted animals more than most men. "Saddle up. Now." The deputies grabbed rifles and lanterns, and within moments, the three men were on horseback, following the streak of white tearing through the snow. Edward Harlow sat in his parlor, the fire crackling, his glass of brandy refilled. He told himself the deed was done, that silence would return to his life. He tried to ignore the phantom echoes he thought he heard, the sobs of his daughters lingering in the corners of his mind. But outside, Snowfire returned, this time not alone. Lantern lights bobbed in the darkness. The pounding of hooves grew louder. Edward froze, his drink trembling in his hand. Snowfire stopped at the gates, rearing and slamming his hooves against the iron bars, whinnying so loud it shook the night. The sheriff and deputies dismounted, eyes narrowing as they saw the horse refusing to leave the gate, his body pressed forward as if pulling them in. "What the devil's going on here?" the sheriff muttered. Snowfire threw his head toward the house, then galloped around the side, stopping at the basement window once more. He pawed furiously at the snow, his neighing sharp and insistent. The deputies exchanged glances, alarm rising. "What's he pointing at?" Collins asked. "Basement," the sheriff said grimly. He raised his lantern, peering at the frosted window. He could just barely see faint movement inside. His heart dropped. Dear God! Inside the freezer, Clara and Elsie's strength waned. Clara's lips were blue, her voice a whisper. "Stay awake, don't close your eyes," but Elsie's head drooped against her shoulder. Clara shook her gently, sobbing, "Please, Elsie, don't." And then, voices. Muffled shouts. The sound of boots above. The girls stirred weakly, pounding what little strength they had left against the steel. Outside, Snowfire neighed again, slamming his hooves against the window frame, refusing to stop until someone answered. The sheriff barked, "Break it open." The deputies grabbed a crowbar from their saddlebags. With a heavy swing, the glass shattered, icy shards falling inward. Snowfire reared back, neighing in triumph. Cold air rushed out, carrying the faint, broken sobs of the twins. The sheriff's face hardened as he shouted, "There are children in there. Get that freezer open." Snowfire stamped the earth, his breath heavy, eyes fixed on the opening. His job wasn't finished, not until the girls were safe. The sound of splintering wood and shouts filled the Harlow estate. Sheriff Wallace and his deputies forced their way through the locked basement door, lanterns raised high, their boots pounding against the stone steps. Snowfire stood above them in the yard, pawing the frozen earth, his nostrils flaring as he waited. He had led them this far, he would not move until the girls were free. Down below, the deputies rushed toward the hulking freezer. Collins dropped to his knees, fumbling with the heavy latch. His fingers slipped on the frozen steel, but with a grunt he tore it open. The lid creaked back, and the lantern light spilled inside. What they saw made their stomachs twist. Clara and Elsie lay curled together, their little bodies trembling, skin pale and lips blue. Clara blinked weakly at the sudden light, barely able to lift her head. Elsie whimpered, her small chest rising in shallow breaths. "They're alive!" Collins shouted. The sheriff stripped off his coat, wrapping it around Clara while Miller lifted Elsie into his arms. The girls clung to their rescuers instinctively, shivering, tears streaking down their faces. Please," Clara whispered, "don't let him." Sheriff Wallace's face hardened like stone. "Don't you worry, sweetheart. You're safe now." As the men hurried the children upstairs, a shadow appeared at the top of the stairwell, Edward Harlow himself. "What's going on here?" he roared, his voice a mask of false outrage. "Why are you in my home?" But before he could step closer, a thunderous sound echoed outside. Snowfire. The stallion reared in the moonlight, hooves slamming down against the cobblestones, neighing with a fury that silenced the night. He charged to the basement window, thrusting his head inside, eyes blazing, ears pinned back. He let out a sharp, furious cry that made even hardened men freeze. It was no random display, he was pointing directly at Edward. The deputy's eyes followed the horse's stance, then looked back at the millionaire standing in the shadows. The truth became undeniable. Wallace's gaze burned into Harlow. "You locked your own daughters in there, didn't you?" Edward faltered. "That's ridiculous. They must have wandered in by mistake." "Save it," the sheriff snapped. "A horse doesn't break out of his stall, run across town, and lead us to your basement window unless he knew something was wrong." And from the looks of it, he knew exactly who's to blame. The crowd had begun to gather outside, roused by the shouts and the stallion's cries. Neighbors pressed against the gates, their faces pale with shock as they saw the sheriff emerge, the twin girls wrapped in coats, their frail arms clinging to the deputies. Gasps rippled through the onlookers. "Dear Lord," someone whispered. "He locked them in a freezer." Edward's mask cracked under the weight of 100 eyes. He stepped back, his composure unraveling. They're weak, always sick. They dragged me down, But his excuses only sealed his fate. Sheriff Wallace gestured sharply. "Collins, Miller, take him." The deputies seized Edward by the arms. He thrashed, shouting, "You can't do this to me. I'm Edward Harlow. This is my house." But the crowd's silence was louder than any protest. They looked at him not with admiration but with horror and contempt. Snowfire stood tall at the edge of the crowd, mane glinting silver beneath the lantern light. His chest rose and fell heavily, his dark eyes fixed on Edward like a judge delivering a silent verdict. And in that moment, the twist became clear. It wasn't the sheriff's suspicions or the deputy's actions that exposed Edward. It was the horse. Snowfire had heard what others ignored. He had carried the truth on pounding hooves through the night, dragging justice out of the shadows. The deputies marched Edward down the steps and into the open square, where the townsfolk stood in tense silence. Mothers clutched their children. Men shook their heads in disbelief. The sheriff lifted his voice. "You all saw it. If not for this horse, these girls would have frozen to death tonight." The crowd erupted, not with cheers, but with angry shouts directed at Edward. "Monster," someone cried. "Shame." Snowfire neighed once more, his body angled protectively toward Clara and Elsie, as though declaring to the world, "They are safe now." The girls, wrapped in quilts, reached out feebly. Their tiny hands brushed against the horse's muzzle, and Snowfire lowered his head gently to them, his breath warm against their chilled skin. Clara whispered through trembling lips, "He saved us." Elsie nodded weakly, eyes glistening. "Snowfire saved us." And the truth rang louder than any courtroom gavel. The days that followed were heavy with whispers. The name Edward Harlow, once spoken with respect in town, now carried only disgust. His wealth, his fine clothes, his reputation, all meant nothing in the face of what he had done. The sheriff's men escorted him to the county jail, where he awaited trial. For the first time in his life, Edward sat not in a leather chair behind a grand desk, but on a cold wooden bench behind iron bars. No brandy. No servants. Just silence and the knowledge that the town no longer saw him as a man of power, but as a monster. Meanwhile, Clara and Elsie remained in the infirmary. Weeks passed as they slowly regained their strength. Quilts were piled high on their small beds, and townsfolk visited daily, bringing food, dolls, or flowers. The twins were no longer hidden away behind iron gates, they were now daughters of the community. And through it all, Snowfire stood vigil. Every morning, the great white stallion could be found outside the infirmary window, his mane shimmering in the dawn light. He would wait quietly until the girls stirred, then nicker softly, as if to remind them, "I am still here." The girls pressed their tiny hands against the glass, smiling weakly at their guardian. One afternoon, when the doctor declared them well enough to go outside, the townsfolk gathered in the square. Clara and Elsie stepped into the sunlight, bundled in thick coats. Their faces were still pale, but their eyes shone brighter than they had in years. And waiting for them was Snowfire. The crowd hushed as the twins ran, still wobbly on their feet, toward the stallion. Snowfire lowered his head, and they wrapped their arms around his neck, burying their faces in his mane. Tears streamed freely, not of pain but of relief. The sheriff stepped forward. "These children are alive because this horse refused to be silent." His voice carried over the square. "We should never forget that loyalty and courage can come from the most unexpected places." Edward's trial was swift. Witnesses testified, the sheriff, his deputies, even neighbors who had seen Snowfire tear through the streets that night. But the most damning evidence was the condition of Clara and Elsie, and the fact that they had been found locked inside the freezer. Edward tried to defend himself with excuses. "I was drunk. I didn't know what I was doing." But the judge's gavel silenced him. Ignorance is no defense for cruelty. You had every chance to be a father, and you chose to be their executioner. The verdict was clear, Edward Harlow was guilty of attempted murder. His sentence would be long, and his wealth would do nothing to save him. The townsfolk left the courthouse that day not with sorrow, but with a sense of justice finally served. Clara and Elsie could not return to the mansion. It was filled with too many ghosts, too much pain. Instead, a kind widow named Mrs. Whitaker opened her home to them. She lived on the edge of town, in a modest farmhouse with creaking floors and a warm hearth. She had no children of her own, and the girls filled a void in her life as she filled one in theirs. Snowfire was moved to her small pasture, where he roamed freely. Each morning, the twins ran barefoot across the grass to greet him, feeding him apples and braiding flowers into his mane. He was not just their protector anymore, he was family. Months later, on a golden spring afternoon, the town gathered again in the square. This time, not for trial or justice, but for gratitude. A bronze plaque was unveiled near the fountain. It read, "To Snowfire, the horse who heard what others ignored, who carried truth on his hooves, and gave voice to the voiceless." The crowd applauded as Clara and Elsie, wearing matching blue dresses, stood proudly beside their beloved horse. Snowfire tossed his head as if bowing, his mane catching the sunlight like threads of silver. Mrs. Whitaker dabbed her eyes with a handkerchief, whispering to a neighbor, "He's not just a horse. He's a miracle." The sheriff, standing tall in his uniform, added quietly, "Not a miracle. Just loyalty. The kind the world needs more of." The applause swelled, echoing off the wooden buildings, filling the air with warmth and hope. Closing moment. As the crowd began to disperse, Clara leaned against Snowfire's shoulder, her small hand pressed to his warm coat. She whispered, "You saved us when no one else could." Elsie added softly, "We'll never leave you, Snowfire. You're our hero." The stallion nickered, pressing his muzzle gently against them, as if sealing a promise. And as the sun dipped low behind the hills, painting the sky in hues of orange and gold, the omniscient voice of the tale lingered over the scene. Sometimes, the bravest heroes do not wear uniforms or speak with words. Sometimes, they stand silently, watching, waiting, and when the moment comes, they act with a courage greater than any man's. Snowfire reminded us all that true strength lies not in wealth or power, but in loyalty, in love, and in the simple act of doing what is right. The camera of imagination would fade out there, Clara and Elsie safe, Snowfire standing tall, and justice finally done. A story of cruelty turned into one of redemption, because one horse refused to let innocence freeze in silence.